Great, so let's start. I'm going to start by just asking, should we care about public debt?
No. Can we have the next question? Why don't we need to care about public debt? There isn't any such thing as public debt. That's why. Because every time somebody supposedly lends money to the government, it's exactly the same as you putting your money in your bank account. If you happen to be one of those lucky people who has money in the bank, you are owed money by your bank. That's what it means. You've got money in the bank means that they owe it back to you. Everything in life is actually got two sides to it. So if you've got money, they owe you. So when people lend money to the government owes it back the same as the bank owes you. But do we go around saying Barclays is going to go bust because it's got a lot of people who save money with it? No, mysteriously, we don't. We think it's a sign of strength for a bank to have lots of people who want to deposit money with it. We think that's great because that's where their capital comes from. So why are we worried about the money that is being lent to the government? The money that's being lent to the government is this sort of thing. You recognise those. Who made it? The Bank of England made it. So the money that... My son over there, Thomas, is laughing because we made a video this morning when I was waving 20 quid notes around and now I'm doing it again. The money that goes back to the government was in the first place created by the government. Because all the money we've got is made by the government at the end of the day. Even the money that's created by private banks, because they're regulated by the government. So all that happens is that the government spends the money in the economy because they don't give these things to you for nothing. They buy something with these when they go out into the economy, and they claim them back by tax. Or, if it hasn't been paid in tax yet, they claim it back by way of giving you the chance to save with them. But there is no crisis about having to repay this money. Has anybody here read Jane Austen? I thought I'd get a few nods. We're an age of an audience which will agree with that. In Jane Austen's novels, mother-in-laws were generally, or prospective mother-in-laws, were generally very good at appraising the value of potential son-in-laws. And how did they do it? They looked at the value of the 4% that the son-in-laws owned. Who was the chap who walked out with the wet shirt on? I've forgotten his name now. Darcy, not Colin Firth, it was Darcy, wasn't it? Darcy had £10,000 in the 4%. So he was a very wealthy guy. Let's remember this. Government debt is private wealth. That's all it means. Why are we worried about people with wealth wanting to deposit their money with the government, which is the safest place to put it? You will have never heard that version of the story before. That's the true version.
But isn't there, so there's an equivalence that happens though, isn't there? Because that's not true of every country. So for instance,
yes.
Right? So when Osborne came in and said, we're going to be like Greece if we don't sort this out.
This is only true of national governments who can create their own currency, which can be traded on international exchanges. So Greece had the euro, and therefore it was constrained. The government of Scotland can't create money because it hasn't got a central bank. It might be called a government, but it's just like the London Borough of... Which London Borough are we in here?
Yeah. I'm just going to push you on this a little bit, because I think there is a point here, though, about trust in that government, in the ability to hold on to that, right? So if a bank suddenly, if you use that analogy, there's a run on the bank and everyone's like, oh my God, you can't trust this bank anymore, the money's about to go missing. Whereas I think the thing that I always say about the UK is that it's a very trustworthy company, to a country to give money to, because there are millions and millions of taxpayers to back it up. And so it's not the same for every country, but it's partly why it'd be cheaper for us to borrow and invest and those sorts of things, because...
Yeah, I mean, look, there are countries in the world where quite clearly the local currency is not something you'll want to use. I was in Lebanon a few years ago, and Beirut is a wonderful city, and I feel immensely for the people there at the moment. if you're in Lebanon, basically you do use the US dollar, you don't use the Lebanese dollar, because the Lebanese dollar is frankly worthless in comparison to the US dollar, and the US dollar circulates everywhere. And so they have a currency which is, in all practical purposes, worthless. Nobody trusted the Lebanese government, and there are parallel governments, as we know, going on in Lebanon anyway. So that's a perfect example of a country which, frankly, is not a good money issuer. But you can't compare that with us. It's like saying, when I always get this, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Weimar Republic. And then you have to say, first of all, you know those three because they are so staggeringly exceptional. Hyperinflation hardly ever happens, and governments hardly ever fail with currencies, and they were, for different reasons, entirely separate from us. Anybody like to guess when we started the UK national debt? You can have a year either side. I'm very generous.
Saying the number, you mean?
Yeah,
reporting
which
the
year?
Number.
1694. Have we ever gone bust yet? No. How many other organisations have been going that long and never gone bust? Very, very few. Our national debt is as good as it gets. Look, we do have a well-managed government. We do have, broadly speaking, the rule of law. We do have a tax system which isn't perfect and doesn't collect all the money owing to it, especially from small companies, where 30% don't pay. But overall, about 92% of tax is collected. That's good enough to guarantee, as you say, the future income stream of the government, which therefore underpins the value of the currency. So if you want somewhere safe to put your money, the government is the safest place to put it. Because if it ever is any doubt, they can print some more of these to repay you. But Northern Rock couldn't do that, nor could Barclays, nor, of course, could Royal Bank of Scotland when they went bust, or anybody else. But the government, yeah, it can produce some more. Where do they go if they produce some more? If the government had to print a whole pile of these to actually hand out to you, if you thought that the government was going to go bust, what would you do with the money? You put it straight back in the bank. Where does the bank put it? Straight back in the Bank of England. Where does the Bank of England put it? Straight back in the Treasury, so it goes back to where it started. Therefore, money always goes back to the government at the end of the day. It is as safe as anything can be in the UK. We really don't have to worry about the national debt.
So, okay, given that, and I'm sure people will want to ask questions about that point, that's the important first point, I guess, to think about, is that we shouldn't be worried about public debt, right? We had this big headline, I think it was last week, we reached 100%, public debt is 100% of GDP, hasn't been this high since the 60s. We should be worried about, we're constantly hearing that all the time. We have to fill this black hole, we've got too much public debt, we have to take away, the winter fuel allowance from 10 million pensioners. We can't give benefits to families with, can't get rid of the 2-child benefit cap. Why are we having that conversation? Why is that the public conversation around government debt, if the reality is, as you say?
It's a choice. There's two choices. One, to understand how the world really works or not. And I'm afraid to say Oxford University. I know you went there.
I'm not a fan, it's fine.
And I didn't, but I wasn't taught very much better at Southampton, where I was, and I don't think actually a lot of universities teach very much better now either. But the reality is that most students of economics are taught total and utter crap. Technical term. They're told that everybody's rational, we're all profit maximizing, we all want to actually ignore the best interests of everybody else, we're only concerned about ourselves, we're all utterly selfish human beings, and all sorts of other things. And the only reason why all of that is taught to make the mathematical models that most economists love work. Because if they assumed anything else, their maths wouldn't work. They also do, by the way, truly appalling mathematics, if anybody is a fan of maths here. They really don't understand a lot of maths. I do know a bit. I'm accused by my wife, who's sitting here tonight, of sometimes walking around the house talking maths, and she doesn't appreciate it. I don't know why, but there we go. So they teach this rubbish economics. It's a choice because it is what keeps them in jobs. If you don't teach that economics, you won't get a professorship. Most decent economists I know are not professors of economics. There is a good guy at Oxford, Danny Dorling.
Oh, yeah.
He's a professor of geography. Really good economist, but he's a professor of geography. I am in the opposition of actually, I think I'm the only person who's actually held a political economy professorship and an accountancy professorship. And that's almost unknown. But basically, I do quite a lot of economics, but I've never been a professor of economics, never expect to be. They teach that rubbish, and they are going to maintain that. And Rachel Reeves has bought it hook, line, and sinker. And for the last 100+ years, the centre of that way of thinking has been the Treasury. It's called the Treasury view. They do believe it's their job to say no to everything. Even now, we're hearing all the rumours coming out of the Labour cabinet that basically the answer to every question is Treasury says no. Not computer says no, Treasury says no. Much the same thing, I think, in real terms these days. But that's what they're choosing to do. And the reason why they're doing it is that they believe that money is made in the private sector. So they believe that guff, which is said by people who work for large companies, we're making money. No, you're not. You're making profit. And profit isn't the same thing as money. Profit doesn't even exist. You can't see it. You can't count it. You can't find it. If you said, can I see your pile of profit? They couldn't show it to you. And I have run a lot of companies and prepared accounts for maybe 1,000 or more entities in my life. And I've still never seen profit because it doesn't exist. All it is the increase in the value of a company over a period, and a loss is the decrease in the value of the company over a period. But it never makes money. But they believe that all money is made in the private sector. It baffles me how they think that these things come into existence as a result. Now, I know in Scotland they have the names of private banks on them, which is quite curious. And that's also true, by the way, in the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. But they actually have to deposit pound for pound money with the Bank of England to be able to issue their notes. So they aren't really private notes at all. They're still Bank of England notes at the end of the day. There is no money but that which is made by the Treasury, but they somehow believe it's made by the private sector. And therefore, they come up with these mad ideas that we are constrained by whatever will be paid to us.
But isn't part of this, though, the reason why they say we're going to, let the private sector lead or partner with the private sector, at least this is the argument, is that actually they're better at doing it, and putting too much of public investment in crowds out this very innovative private sector investment. That's the argument.
That's
right?
the argument. I know you're playing devil's advocate here.
Yes.
I don't think you believe a word of that. Let's, however, deal with that argument that all these clever people in the private sector can do it so much better than government. If there's one thing that I think defines what I call neoliberal government and neoliberal economics, that's it. I wrote a book in 2011 called The Courageous State. I was a slightly negligent parent, I remember. At the time, we went on holiday in the Isle of Wight, and we let him run around a play park for basically a fortnight while I wrote a book, if truth be told. I think you were reading a pile of medical journals at the time as well. But anyway, they had a great time running around this wonderful play park in the Isle of Wight while I was scribing away on this book. And the big argument of The Courageous State was, what I wanted was a government that actually believed that government was worthwhile. Because what we have, and I was criticising at that moment Blair and Brown and then Cameron and Clegg and that sort of generation, who every problem they saw, they said, not ours to deal with, the private sector will sort with that. And I wanted courageous politicians who would actually say, it's our problem to deal with. Because I believe that's what neoliberal politicians do. They think it's there. But look, we've given them long enough now, 40 years. Have we got great rental housing sector as a consequence? No, we've got mouldy housing. Have we solved all the problems of poverty? No, definitely not. We do have the problems which are all exacerbated by the two-child cap. Have we got a thriving private sector? No, actually, you can hear them saying we need big subsidies for the FTSE 100 because the stock market's in the doldrums. Can you please subsidise us some more? Do you know how much we subsidise the FTSE 100 a year from state taxation revenues? It's £70 billion. It's called the subsidy that goes to pension savers. Most people who are in the top 10% of earners in the UK get a bigger subsidy for their pension saving from the state each year than anyone on benefits in the UK does. The idea that there are benefits for the wealthy is absolutely true. And that's how it works. They get subsidies for the pension schemes and then for the FTSE 100. There is simply no evidence that the private sector knows better than the state. And I'll go back to that 1694 figure. How many private companies have been around since 1694, still going strong and paying out? The answer is precisely Zero. That's how many are doing it. The rest
I'm
will
just
go.
going to, just because I know, well, we'll pick up if people do ask questions on the economics, but I do want to get into the politics more, because I think this argument about how the economy works, in particular public debt, is one of the major ways in which we don't get nice things and we don't get to, right? And the wall is pulled over our eyes, and people will say, and I've knocked on thousands of doors with many of you here, and people will say, well, we can't afford to do that, can we? Where's the money going to come from? And that's, it's just a typical thing you hear back again and again. I want to turn to really get into the politics of this, and I guess the Labour Chancellor and where we are. What precisely do you think is driving them in adopting some of what just sounds like Osborne all over again?
I find it really scary that George Osborne and Ed Balls now make a podcast together. And Ed Balls is, of course, married to Yvette Cooper, and therefore direct access into the cabinet, etc. And they were at Ed Balls, George Osborne's wedding. I mean, the relationships are incredibly close. I now describe them as the single transferable party. It's a term that's come up on my blog, and we've sort of started talking about this. There's only one party in the UK now. It doesn't matter whether it's the Labour flavour or the Tory flavour. We seem to be getting the same policies in either case. So when we vote, we just transfer who's managing the single transferable party. We don't actually change the policies. And I think that's a really important idea to hold in your mind, because we are obviously missing the sorts of ideas that you and I have talked about in the past, and which we, I think, share a lot of common ground on. What was your question?
I mean, what do you think? I mean, given that
Rachel Reeves, why is she doing this?
Because also, you think about the last 14 years, and people do want change. I mean, they literally voted for change.
Yes.
And a lot of people understand now that austerity was not a good idea. And you look at, every part of all of our public services, they're all on the floor. It seems very difficult to get an appointment at the hospital to... we've got a bridge closure here. We can't get money for that to be reopened. I mean, they just closed the library because of I mean, it's just
I noticed the library shut. I looked on Google Maps. It said temporarily closed.
Yes.
I wondered how long is temporary.
Yes.
I guess it's long term, is it really?
Right. And the answer we get back, and even when I was still a candidate and going to internal meetings at the Labour Party, asking the questions about can we get our bridge fixed, etc., is like you're right. The answer was there's no money.
There is money. Rachel Reeves has decided to buy the Treasury line. Can I be
Has she decided to, or do you think she believes it?
Well, I think she probably believes it. I think she does believe it. I don't know whether everybody in Labour believes it. I think there may be one or two who don't. The most likely not to, from the whisperings I hear, is Ed Miliband, who I still think is willing to be a little bit awkward. After all, he has no ambition to be leader anymore, so he can be perhaps a little bit more awkward than average, but not very.
So not even the borrow to invest line, you think?
The borrow to invest line doesn't even seem to work either. It's like there is no money, and they genuinely don't seem to have any comprehension that money is created by the government. Can I just explain what happens when the government wants to spend? Because this is completely different to any experience you've got. We have the government passes a budget, okay? That makes everything it's going to spend legal. Nobody can argue with that because it's the law, it may spend it. So long as the government then asks the Bank of England to make a payment for it, it will be legal, therefore the Bank of England can't say no to it. There's two reasons why it can't say no. One, there's been a law since 1866 that says it can't. And the second one is that the government owns the Bank of England, so it can't actually, at the end of the day, answer back. They will pretend they're independent, but that's a complete sham, by the way. There is an override clause that says whenever the Chancellor likes, they can overrule the Bank of England. So never believe the bank acts independently, it doesn't. So the bank simply marks up the overdraft every time the government says it wants a payment. But they believe that there is a shortage of money in the world. And once upon a time, to some degree, there was. We were on something called the gold standard. It was always sort of complied with, that there was gold in the bank to swap for your note. This thing had something behind it. There is now nothing behind this. And in the days when notes were made out of something decent called paper, at this point I would have torn this in half to show how worthless it is. It didn't matter because Tesco's always takes sellotaped up one, so it doesn't. But I did it to show that there was nothing behind it. So just believe I've just torn a 20 quid note in half. That's how valueless that is in itself. You're just taking the government's word, but they don't believe their word is good enough, so they won't go out and spend. Even though if they did spend on that bridge, the first thing they'd do would be actually spend money on people who would be employed to work on it. What would those people who were employed to work on it do? They'd immediately pay tax. What was left over, they would spend. What would the person who got the money they spent do the moment they got it? They'd pay tax. What's left over would be spent. And guess what? This is called the multiplier effect. The Treasury never allows for this in its calculations. Now, some things have very low multiplier effects. Defence spending is appalling. It does not generate good multiplier effects. Spend £1 on defence and you get much less than £1 back. Spend £1 on the NHS and you'll get £4 or £5 back. Not because of the immediate consequence, but because you put somebody who's unwell into work, and that person who goes into work pays tax and doesn't claim benefits anymore and doesn't claim costs on the NHS anymore. So we have positive multiplier effects. In other words, they ignore the fact that actually their spending generates the money to pay for itself. They are not like us. If I chuck Thomas out of the house and say, I never want to see you again, I've saved the cost. See ya, fella. But the government can't do that. Where are people going? If the government says we don't want you, they're just going to claim benefits. So it doesn't make sense. The government and the household are completely different. But we get Rachel Reeves, and this is how we know she's economically bonkers. That's one of the nicer descriptions I've used about her of late. She tells us that she's going to manage the economy like her mother managed the household budget when she sat down at the kitchen table to look at the bank statement and balance the books. The trouble is, her mother didn't own the bank. Rachel Reeves does. And that puts her in a fundamentally different economic position. But she doesn't understand that. And that's really worrying when you've got to the point of being Chancellor of the Exchequer.
All right, final question from me, and then I'm going to open it up. Although I would love to ask more, but I'm going to let others. So what would you advise Rachel Reeves to do? The budget's coming up end of October. What would you tell her to do?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, for God's sake, let's deal with some of the social problems in our society. I wrote a book a while ago, it is a while ago now, called The Joy of Tax. When I was lecturing still, I had to explain to my students that tax was the most interesting three-letter word ending in X in the English language, and nobody had ever written a book described as the joy of something else with the three-letter word ending in X, about which I was taking the mickey. David Cameron actually did claim at the Conservative Party conference in 2015 that he took my book home and tried it out with Samantha and it didn't work. That was the tackiest joke of the Weir Award, apparently, for him. Anyway, he actually said it at Conservative Party conference. One of my great achievements. The joy of tax is that tax can shape the society that we live in. We live in a deeply unfair, unequal society. I would be increasing tax on the wealthy. I wrote a report. I started publishing it in September a year ago and finished publishing it in March, and it was called the Taxing Wealth Report, and you can download it. There's only 126,000 words of it. It wasn't meant to be that long. I just didn't know when to stop. And I found £97 billion of extra taxes I could raise on people who were earning, broadly speaking, £80,000 plus a year. Most of it for people who are earning a lot more than that. Simple things. Let's equalise capital gains tax and income tax rates. Let's charge national insurance on everybody at the same rate, however much they earn, rather than letting it drop by 6% now, when you're earning over 50,000 a year. Why do you get a reduction? Because you're earning over 50,000 a year? Who knows? Why is there no national insurance on investment income when you could actually charge it? And the legislation to do it is still on the statute book. It just was cancelled. It made a 0% tax by Margaret Thatcher in 1985. We could put it back again. That would raise 18 billion a year. Equalising the capital gains tax and income tax rates, 12 billion a year. Why do we subsidise the pension contributions of the wealthy more than we do those on a basic rate of income tax? I don't know. Why are my savings apparently worth subsidising at twice the rate of most people's? Isn't that desperately unfair? Yes, I'm a higher rate taxpayer, I admit it, because that's what university professors tend to end up on. As if we just equalise those, there's another £14 billion. How much money do you want? I can find it for you. She should be doing that, and that would be the indication that not only does she want fairness, but she will raise the money. And if she insists she has to balance the books, that's the way to do it. She doesn't need to balance the books. That's a complete load of old kibosh.
But isn't that the problem that you get into, isn't it? Because tax, like you say, we need tax. We need it for redistribution. And that's the thing, right? We need it because of inequality and huge amounts of inequality. So just making it about raising money plays into the idea that
we don't need to raise the money. We need to spend the money as well. If we spent the money, we get a lot of tax back, but we could also raise money to balance the books if that's what she insists on doing. My point is we can shift the balance of the economy. Instead of having this economy which is petrified of the state going over more than 40% of the share of the economy, we should probably be living in a society where 50% is provided by the state. How many more of these do we really need? We've probably, almost all of us, got one, or whatever else it is. Lots and lots of people are consuming to excess and the planet is burning as a consequence. But we haven't got hospitals, we haven't got decent transport systems, we haven't got the transition to sustainable energy, we haven't dealt with poverty, we haven't got decent social housing for everybody needs it with security of tenure to guarantee that you can bring up your children in the security of knowing they will always be able to go to the same school and not be thrown out at the end of next week because of an eviction notice. All of those things we haven't got because they're petrified of the fact they've got to keep the state small. And that's why she's going to deliver austerity too. And if I'm really cynical, I will tell you this. Why does she think that's a good idea? Because there'll be a nice seat lined up for her when she ceases to be Chancellor in some bank somewhere. Terribly cynical, but that's how I see it. That's what Labour ministers of old have done. Look at Alan Milburn now advising the Department of Health on the future of the NHS. He was, if you can remember that far back, a health secretary for Labour under Blair and Brown. And now he's a specialist in delivering private medical solutions. And he's loved by the Tony Blair Institute, and he's loved by Wes Streeting. Okay. And he's made a fortune by that. I'm desperately cynical, but that's how I see it.
I would say my slightly, though I've become a bit cynical for obvious reasons, my less cynical take is that I think because Labour, and this is also what I heard internally, it was this sense of, people always think we spend a lot and we can't be trusted on the economy. So they're going so hard the other way. They're playing so much to the audience, and they don't see their power coming from the left and progressives. They see their power coming from those that do believe that that public debt is a problem and have bought into all of that, and don't think that we can have nice things essentially. And so they think that if they can still more of the Conservatives' clothes and way of being, that they will be in power for longer. And that is why. And it's still a cynical reason. Like, I think a lot of them know it's not true. I met the professors that taught Rachel Reeves. So,
but can I tell you a story about that?
Go on.
Because this, of course, happened before. When Blair and Brown came into office in 1997, and I remember being quite pleased to be rid of the Tories. At least that election, you actually felt as though something might change just for a moment or two. Blur went to Downing Street. There was a difference, if ever you saw one. But they did effectively a form of austerity, which is exactly what Ken Clarke had laid out in 1996-97 and said he'd do. And he laughed himself silly afterwards. He said, I knew we were going to lose. We were never going to deliver that. It was impossible to deliver it, and they did. How amazing. And that's exactly what's happening now. She thinks she's got to deliver Jeremy Hunt's fiscal rule so that she's credible. Jeremy Hunt couldn't have delivered it. Why does she want to try? I just don't understand it. I just don't.
And just one final thing, just because people don't always get this right, and it's interesting because actually I was at work the other day at LSE and someone said to me, it won't be austerity if she does X on taxes or whatever, but do you want to tell us the definition of austerity?
Look, in my opinion, austerity is the choice to restrict the size of state spending to reduce the share of public debt as a proportion of GDP, which sounds pretty technical, but I've just told you, public debt doesn't matter. GDP is a made-up number. Just to make clear how stupid the number for GDP is, anybody here own their own home? So I can't be alone. Right. You pay yourself rent to live in your house, don't you? Don't you? 10% of UK GDP is made up of the rent that the Treasury says you pay yourself for the right to live in your own home. Really? It is that stupid a number. It's 10% of 2.8 trillion. In other words, they say 280 billion pounds is paid as rent. Can I show you how that rent's paid? See this 20 quid note? Comes out of this pocket, goes over there, goes in that pocket. That's it. It's made up. There's no rent. But this is what they manage. It is gobbledygook, and they're using that to prevent us having the services we need. This is politics aligned against us, and that's why I'm a political economist. Political economy is about how power relationships affect the allocation of resources in society. And the power relation of the City of London aligned with the Treasury in Westminster makes sure that we don't get the services that we need. And that's it.
Okay, great. That's a good point to pause and take questions from people. Whatever your thoughts, short comments, welcome. I'm going to pick on you, sir, in a minute. But let me see if there's others that want to come in. Oh, wait.
Your comment about the joy of tax and increasing tax, and how you could raise 50-odd billion by raising taxes to prevent austerity. Why not take an easier route and just borrow more money?
Look, I'm not saying you couldn't borrow more money. I'm saying you could borrow more money. Because if you did, in the first place, simply borrow the money and then spent it into the economy, as I've just explained to you, through the multiplier effect, it will come back. So actually, the right answer is, as with most things in life, is do a bit of both. And one of the problems we have in politics is apparently we're all on the left or we're all on the right. We all live either in a capitalist system or in a state socialist system. And people accuse me of being a communist frequently. I find that really weird. I was a fellow at the University of Sussex in 2004, and I asked them, am I a Marxist? And they said, no, you're definitely not Marxist, Richard. If anybody knows who isn't a Marxist, the University of Sussex does, I can promise you. I'm not a Marxist, I'm not a communist, of course I'm not, and I'm a chartered accountant who's been a director, chair, chief executive of quite a number of commercial organisations. I believe in the mixed economy. In most situations, the answer is you do a bit of both. So you might want to raise some tax for social purposes because we have a problem with inequality, and inequality is bad for society in its own right. And you will get more growth if you reallocate money from the wealthy to those who are poor, because the wealthy just put it in a bank account and don't spend it, and the poor spend it. Therefore, you get a bigger multiplier effect by simply reallocating wealth from the wealthy to the poorest, so you boost your economy faster. So if she wants growth, that's what she'd do. But there is no reason why you couldn't borrow more, particularly if you're going to say you're going to rebuild your bridge.
So this is the key thing, right? It's you borrow to invest, but think about where it will really create the most jobs, right?
Yes,
because like
precisely.
you say, because that's the thing. Actually, the focus shouldn't be like we have to pay down public debt and cut this and cut that. The focus should be how can we create as many good jobs, well-paid jobs as possible, and that will ultimately pay down the debt.
Yes.
And so we look at this at the wrong way of that equation, if that makes sense. So, and that's the frustration, isn't it? That the conversation isn't like how do we create more opportunities, which is a positive conversation as well. And it's all about like we have to cut this and that. I'm just going to take the question from behind you. Did you have that? Oh.
A lot of economists will argue there are a lot of disbenefits in increasing taxes, particularly given the fact that we've got a very high tax burden at the moment, and that it's better for public investment through borrowing rather than see any disbenefits of tax increases.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but I'm saying that's a view that's put forward.
I dealt with that argument in that book, The Joy of Tax, actually. I looked at about 175 countries around the world and looked at a very simple ratio. What percentage of their GDP was paid in tax? What was their GDP per head in terms of income? And then when you plot them against each other, the line is almost straight up there. And it goes, here's low tax, low income. Here's high tax, high income. Or the other way around if you're away. The answer in an economist's graph, by the way, is always in Middlesbrough, because everything always heads up to the northeast. If you come from Middlesbrough,
Let's
you
come
are
back.
the ultimate answer to the ultimate question.
Let's-
But that's the point. There's absolutely no evidence that high-tax economies do not function well. Nobody's yet found the answer to that.
We will come back to taxes a bit more, actually, because in my new role at LSE, we're looking a lot at wealth taxes. And I think there's obviously a lot of conversation around that right now. And I do think there's pros and cons of different things. But yeah, let's come back to that. I'm going to take 3 questions in a row.
Yeah.
And then I'll make a note.
So will I.
Okay, so there was a gentleman behind. Hi. Do you want to introduce yourself as well? Sorry.
Yes. Well, my name is Steve.
Hi, Steve.
Richard, I think you're too generous towards the likes of Rachel Reeves.
I try to be nice.
You say economics is a short crap. I think they know they're talking crap. And I think what this is all about is we've lived in a neoliberal world now for 30, 40 years. We know what the effects of that are. It widens the gap between the house and the house-house, both within countries and between countries. And they know what they're doing. This is all, so if we're going to change things, it's not economic arguments we need to win, it's political arguments we need to win. Because eventually, I can't believe she doesn't understand. I've watched a lot of your videos on YouTube recently. I can't believe she doesn't know most of that and doesn't understand that. I think you said in one of your videos, I mean, like many of them, they're looking for the future when they're no longer in the political limelight, and they're looking for that nice, comfortable job when they'll be looked after, because they've looked after the people with power and money. And I think that's what it's all about. So, yeah, I wonder, perhaps we spend too much time thinking about the economic arguments when really it's the political arguments that need to be won.
Okay.
More questions? Yeah, Keely.
2 questions I have that I'm sitting here. Maybe. First of all, in relation to making more money, why does no one ever pursue full employment? And then the other thing is that I was around when, Thatcher, should I say rest in peace, decided to set up social housing. And no one seems to be saying, housing associations say, we're not selling it off, we'll build it, and we'll rent it out, but we're not allowed to buy it. But when they talk about councils doing it, they're planning to sell it off again. I just don't understand that. Surely, by keeping it, you'd be able to keep the money, and people would have secure tenancies. But, the government wants to think about that. So, yeah, the explanation would be great.
Okay, thank you. And one more? Yeah. Yeah.
My name's Darryl. Richard, you said that government debt isn't a problem. The government has to pay interest on the debt. I'm guessing you're going to say that isn't a problem either, but could you maybe explain that?
Yeah.
Because that's always the thing they say, right? They'll say we pay X amount, it's like a waste of money. And people will, again, relate that to their credit card or their overdraft. And they also do the next generation, your children will be paying this off. And they always use that argument, right? Yeah, a few things there. Do you want to?
I'm leaving my debts to him. No, I'm not. Okay, I'll try and deal with those in order. Do the neoliberals know? I don't know they do. I used to meet Rachel Reeves in her office sometimes. She was elected in 2010. I remember my first meeting with her. It was actually with Clive Lewis and Rachel Reeves, and they'd both been recently elected, and they were both interested in economics. And Clive I still get on with, but Rachel stopped talking to me some time ago because she was absolutely adamant about all this stuff then. She really was dyed in the wool, and I don't think there's been a lot of change. Everything she learnt at the Bank of England, she claims that, if you listen to her, you would think she was the most senior person running the whole of the bank or something else. Actually, she spent most of her time seconded to Washington. Don't know why they didn't want her in London, but they sent her there. But the point is, she wasn't very senior, but she did learn the rhetoric at the Bank of England. I've never seen a hint that she thinks anything else. But I entirely agree with you, because let's stand back from this. Neoliberalism was created by a very deliberate ploy. Hayek and Milton Friedman in 1947 set up something called the Mont Pelerin Society. Mont Pelerin is in Switzerland. They met in a hotel at the base of the mountain, and they decided they were going to set up a series of think tanks going around the world which were going to spread the anti-Keynesian socialist far-left view that they thought was then prevailing. We were creating an NHS that was communist and the world was going to collapse and we were all going to end up behind the Iron Curtain and everything because we had free eye tests at that time. That was their belief, and they set up those think tanks. Well, of course, they're still here. How many times have I had to debate with the Institute of Economic Affairs? Dear Mark Littlewood, who ended up as the senior economic advisor, and I did the budget commentary on Radio 2 together for 14 years. Every time he walked in, I called him, "Hi, comrade, how are you doing?" He didn't like that very much, don't know why. But they succeeded because they did the politics. They didn't sell the economics as such. We need to be politically smarter. There's no two ways around it. We have to get the narratives back. But what's really depressing now is that most of the left-wing supposed think tanks, look at IPPR, are selling the same sort of, frankly, neoliberal nonsense, if I'm blunt. I mean, I really don't have much confidence in anything that they're putting out at all. It sounds like they're endorsing the privatisation of the NHS just like anybody else to me at the moment. We are lacking, well, one, the firepower, because there aren't many people trained in the alternatives, two, the money, and three, the think tanks to do this, and we really need to do more on that. That's why I bang out a video a day on YouTube, because I want to actually talk about these ideas, and sometimes I repeat myself. I don't care really, because the ideas have to go out and about. So that's that one. Full employment. Full employment should be in the mandate of the Bank of England, as far as I'm concerned. It is in the US Fed's, the Federal Reserve's mandate. They are meant to control inflation subject to full employment. Doesn't seem to make a lot of odds, if I'm totally honest. But nonetheless, it is there, and it should be there, so we can at least ask them about it. There is no point in managing an economy about inflation. The inflation we've just suffered was caused by external shocks. Reopening from COVID, supply chain crises on getting kitchen units from the Far East back to here because people wanted to spend money after we basically could do so after COVID was over, and then a war in Ukraine, which created a totally artificial hike in prices of commodities, utterly unnecessarily. I mean, the hikes in the prices of oil and gas and wheat and fertilizers was because market traders reacted in exactly the same way as people did about the shortage of toilet rolls in March 2020. There never was a shortage of toilet rolls in March 2020. They're just people panicked. The same happened with regard to market traders. That's how rational these people are. But as a consequence, we ended up with draconian measures of high interest rates. We'll come back to interest rates in a second, to try to beat inflation, which was totally unnecessary. Why do we not worry about housing, which is in housing associations and we do in councils? It's exactly the same as the difference between public debt and private debt. Which at the moment is more worrying in the UK economy and which is more likely to fail? Public debt or private debt? Private debt. Which is bigger? Public debt or private debt? Private. 142% of GDP at the moment, private debt. Whereas public debt is 100%, supposedly, although I've just pointed out that GDP is a stupid number and public debt's a stupid figure. But if we believe that, we've still got a bigger problem in private debt. It's pure politics. So you're right, politics is the answer to this question. Interest. I did actually point somebody on the blog today who asked me a question about why does Darren Jones, who's the new Chief Secretary to the Treasury, say that we are paying £115 billion of interest on the national debt? Well, the first thing he said was the wrong number because the cost this year will supposedly be £87 billion. So he actually quoted a number that was 2 years out of date because it was bigger than the one that was available now. So he wanted the biggest one he could get. I don't think that was very good politics. If I'm totally honest, I have rather lost faith in Darren Jones since he ceased to be a chair of a parliamentary committee and moved to the Treasury. The interest cost is vastly lower than you are told. Of that total figure of around 87 billion a year, this year, half will not be paid for about 15 years. If you were told you didn't have to pay the interest on your mortgage for the next 15 years, would you be happier? Would you be celebrating the fact? Or would you be saying, I can't do anything else because I've got a bill to pay in 15 years' time, during which period I could save up to make payment? No, we apparently can't have hospitals now because we're going to pay some interest in 15 years' time, and that is the interest that is due on what is called indexed bonds. And indexed bonds, when they are redeemed, have an extra payment made at the end to reflect the rate of interest during the time that they have been in issue. That increase is almost disappearing now, by the way, because, of course, inflation has gone down to only about 2%. Therefore, that won't be a problem again. But most of that cost that we're talking about, which is being used as the reason why we can't have any spending because we've got to pay for the interest, is a made-up number, and the accounting for it is absolutely dire. It should be accounted for in stages over the next 15 years because that's the average age of these bonds. And then we wouldn't have a crisis now saying we can't spend anything because we've got to pay this debt when we're not going to.
But I mean, that's even more of an argument for investment and creating good jobs.
It's also a proper argument for proper accounting. Our government doesn't even do double entry bookkeeping. Its balance sheet doesn't balance. And I was told by the gentleman in the front here that he used to teach GCSE accounting. If your balance sheet doesn't balance, you fail. This government produces every single balance sheet it's ever produced in a way that it doesn't balance. It's truly appalling. As an accountant, it offends me deeply.
We can tell. We can tell what it does. Yeah, did you want to say anything? Was there...
Those were the questions I think I had.
Yes, okay, let's have the next one. I want to come back to also the politics, and this is partly why we're meeting as well, right? I want to leave some time at the end for us to speak to each other, because actually the thing that I learned, having come from being an economist and working in think tanks, is that the organising on the ground and building the political movements is what is going to change things. Because actually the people at the top and going through these typical universities are by themselves not going to do it. We need that upward push, and that's why we need to understand just how much we're being lied to on this.
That's where we first met. It was in class.
Yes, okay.
You were there? Yeah.
Okay, let me take 3 more questions. Okay, Casper.
Hi. I just had a question about, you talked about how there's a lot of money, we only collect about 92% of the tax we're supposed to. For example, I think last year, our ex-Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, made about £2.2 million just of income, and he only paid 23% because most of it was from capital gains and from dividends, which is 20%. Like you said, we should equalise capital gains as we pay income. So, he is essentially paying less tax than someone earning £50,000 a year. For example, I know this is in another country, but Donald Trump only paid, I think, £750 in tax. But so what is the solution to that?
And well, let's come back to that. And also, I think there is some possibility that we could see this happen, right? That Rachel Reeves could. But we'll talk about that. I know that some of my colleagues at LSE are they're pushing quite hard and they're quite positive about it. But let's see. Sorry, there was loads of. Yeah, you had that. Yeah, hiya.
My name is Minna. I guess my question is coming from the other side. I think, and I agree with the sentiment when you're talking about it was more about the politics. What can we do? Because I'm so bored of the government.
They've only been in government for a few months. Yeah.
It's frustrating.
Yeah.
Because I feel like everything that you're saying, it makes sense. I think we understand most of it, so we just have to do walk through employment. It doesn't sound like they're going to listen. It doesn't sound like they've literally fired the person that knows what she's talking about. So what can we do? Because I'm tired of waiting for them.
Yep.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. Hey, how you doing? Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Hi. I'm Lauren. I'd like to ask your opinion on the prospective student loan increases. I hear they're set to increase to above £10,000, which I can't lie, I find to be a teeny bit disappointing as a student myself. But I'd like to ask, in your political and economic opinion, why do you think they're increasing? Because according to your logic, the multiplier effect will produce more money for the economy. And is there any future in which you could see student loans potentially decreasing in a possibly utopian future?
It shouldn't be that utopian. In lots of countries around the world, right, you can go to uni and don't have, and the student loan system has become more corrupt. I think, you know, the interest rates were much lower when I took a student loan. It's just become much worse over time. Thank you for that question, Lauren, and nice to see you. I'll just take, let me just take a couple more and then we'll do one last round quickly. Hiya, how you doing?
Hi. When politicians propose taxing ordinary people like us, there's no reason not to do it. When there's proposals to tax wealthy, we're always told, oh, and if you do that, then they'll take their wealth overseas, they'll take it somewhere else, and we'll lose out. Can we hear the real story of that?
Yeah. And just to say, just these questions are making me think of different people that I can pull in. If you've got ideas or subjects that you want covered in these monthly discussions, then let me know. And definitely we need to have something, I suppose, specific on the wealthy and inequality, which obviously is my thing, so I can co-host that with someone. Let me take one more and then we'll do a final round, don't worry. Yeah, hiya.
Hi there, just maybe similar to that question around, you've talked about quite lucky you've got fiat currency, but money, is something that we've all just made up. How do we start to think about the materials that we need for building bridges, or how do we get the medicines to support the hospitals nearby? Thinking like a global citizen, how can we do things here with the fiat currency that helps us and other people beyond our borders?
Well, yeah, there's a massive conversation happening. I mean, if you look at the way in which this country has put other countries in debt around the world, it's really scary. And of course, it's just a new phase of empire and colonialism. And there's a massive push around the world for some debt cancellation, although we don't really hear much about that in the press here, but it's a huge issue. Okay, loads there for you to...
Yeah, just a bit. Just a bit. Where were we? The tax gap was the first question. I've probably written more about the tax gap than anybody else in the UK, which isn't perhaps something one should shout about at this time of the evening. But I have. I've done a lot of research on it. I've written quite a lot of academic papers on it, and I've even peer-reviewed the European Union's tax gap estimates at their request. So I guess I must be okay at this stuff. At 8% of tax not paid in the UK, we are probably in a pretty good state. The revenue, by the way, says it's 5%. But why would you let them mark their own homework? I mean, that's what they do. We need that figure independently audited. So they admit that small businesses don't pay 30% of their corporation tax, but apparently they pay over all the VAT and PAYE that they owe. Yeah, of course they do. I mean, are they really that stupid to believe that just because they don't pay one tax, they won't pay another tax? But apparently they really can't extrapolate from one to the other. So the tax gap is bigger than the government admits. You mentioned the problem of Rishi Sunak obviously not paying his tax. Rishi Sunak's, complied with the law. Let's be clear. Most of his income was made up of capital gains, manipulated, no doubt, by clever financial advisors to ensure that that was the case, because they were going to be taxed at 20% rather than at what he should have been paying, which was 45%. There was still no national insurance involved either way, which is also the other scandal, because, of course, this was investment income and he wasn't paying as much as if he'd actually gone out to work to earn that money, which is even worse. We have this absurd situation that the rich are subsidised by the tax system by not paying national insurance. What we really need to do in this country is actually do better tax gap analyses. I actually would like there to be an office for tax responsibility, which is actually responsible for auditing HM revenue and customs specifically and having the skills to do it.
So do you want to explain the tax gap? So but essentially what we should be getting.
The difference in the tax gap is simply the difference between what we should get and what we do get.
But is it ever possible to really recruit? I mean, absolutely, you shouldn't reward those doing something wrong, because you need to get that tax back. But I always wonder now, when I hear government say we're going to close this loophole and that loophole, if that is just rhetoric, because it doesn't seem to really happen.
The government makes up some pretty wild estimates, and the track record on this, like most government economic estimates, is they're pretty wild about what they can recover. The reality is that it would be actually easy to recover a lot more tax from the UK economy if only we did some very sensible things. One is we would actually regulate small limited companies in the UK. We have, and we made a video about this morning, which will be out later this week, and I actually referred to Lou Reed's Take a Walk on the Wild Side, because company law in the UK is pretty much like taking a walk on the wild side. There isn't any. We don't have company law in the UK. Well, we have lots of it. We have an enormous act, but nobody ever enforces it. So therefore, form a company, do what you like, throw it away after 18 months, form another one, start again, never pay any tax, never own up to anything, never file any accounts, and you keep on doing that time after time, and no penalties are charged ever. So we let that happen because we choose not to regulate companies. Why does the government want to do that? They undermine honest traders for a start. So crazy things like that. So we could do that. But it's not a tax law that needs to change. Oddly, it's a company law that needs to change. And there's quite a lot of examples of things like that where we actually need to change the environments around tax. But we could do this. We could cooperate better internationally. And I was heavily involved in trying to expose the secrecy of tax havens for many years. And in the process, and I haven't got time to explain how, I took away half the income of the government of the Isle of Man, which was quite fun, really.
That's an excellent case, isn't it? Because a lot of push was made on having some transparency in what money was going into tax havens and beneficial ownership and registries, so you could actually see who really owned that company. But actually, they've been able to avoid it. A lot of the British jurisdictions have been able to avoid having that register.
Well, we don't have it. And we also, in 2005, there were 100,000 people work for HM Revenue and Customs. And there's 65,000 now. Just suppose we kept 100,000. Do you think we'd have collected more tax? I think we probably would. They would have even answered the telephone every now and again to people who would like to find out what's going on. But they don't. Sometimes, and I'm going back to the politics here, the biggest change we made in the campaign against tax havens, which in French are fiscal paradis, which sounds wonderful. I'll have a bit of fiscal paradise, thank you very much. No, we didn't want that, so we renamed them secrecy jurisdictions. And at that moment, we began to win. That was the April 2009 G20 summit in London, which I happened to be at, which I found very strange, to be totally honest, but I helped negotiate at that summit. So, look, we can deal with these problems. We have to be realistic about the politics, and most of it is still down to politics. I've lost my list of notes now. I'll get back there. We were going next to what can we do? I always answer this question in the same way. You can phone into the Jeremy Vine show, because I appear on it quite often. I've been on in the last week, in fact, upsetting Jeremy on the very point of domicile. So we're going to get to that next. And debating the question of domicile. They seem to like me on the Jeremy Vine show. Jeremy doesn't like me very much because he once asked what were we going to do about non-jobs in government, and I looked him in the eye, and we were live. I was in the studio and I said, well, being paid $500,000 a year to spin records on Radio 2, which is pretty close to government, sounds like one of the best non-jobs I've ever heard of. The producer in my ear said, keep going, keep going, keep going. Jeremy spun another record. But I'm serious about the fact that this is the sort of thing you can do. Do you know, they don't have enough people phone into the Jeremy Vine show. They have their regulars who all seem to be, shall we say, on the far right of the political agenda. And so when they need a mad person to actually offer a stupid opinion, they phone up somebody from Godalming who's actually always guaranteed to come up with a silly opinion, and they put them on air. But you could phone in and you could learn a bit of the narrative on some of these issues and go in on it, or write a letter to the local paper or whatever. But there is the opportunity to learn bits of economics. You don't have to learn it all and actually make your point.
I think the point, though, I think this is and I totally share this frustration that we've saying about this stuff about austerity. We've been saying the same things for so long, is, what can we do? How can we organise? I do think that knowing the problems is part of it. And I like the idea of calling up, even
but
LBC
just
and showing that this is different.
My point is, just explain the multiplier effect. There isn't a black hole. The government doesn't pour money into a hole and it never goes anywhere.
But what you're saying is
Someone
calling
gets
up,
it.
the calling them out on some of
calling
this.
them out on
Yeah.
it is that's my point. Always just tell them, when you build a bridge, you pay people. Well, those people immediately go and spend some money and they pay tax on the way, and then the next person does. Whatever it is, that simple story works. They don't know how to handle it. Jeremy Vine would be tied up in knots for ages on that one. He wouldn't know what to do. So I better move on. Student loans. There's a whole chapter in the Tax and Wealth Report on student loans. I hate student loans. I'm unambiguously. They are an accounting contract. Half that debt is now sold to offshore companies as if it's commercialised, productised debt. You are designed. The whole purpose of student loans was to guarantee that you would be too frightened to argue with your bosses because you were in debt for life. It was enslavement. It's rather like a mortgage. Do you know what mortgage stands for? In the original derivation of the word, grip of death. Mort is death. It's the grip of death. You're in debt. You're controlled by the person to whom you owe money. Student debt was created to make sure that you weren't a bunch of troublesome students going into the workplace who wouldn't then work. Wait till they meet Generation X. They're very awkward. So, no, we don't need it. Most of it won't be repaid. I can't remember the total numbers. The numbers are in the Tax and Wealth Report. There's something like 300 billion of student debt out there at the moment. And loads of people are crushed by this extra 10% tax, which if it was charged on the highest paid people over the age of 50, people like me, who of course never paid for their student loan and never paid for their student debt because we had full grants when we went to university, well, certainly full fees paid, they wouldn't want to pay that 10% tax. Young people have to. But do you know what the total amount of that tax paid by young people a year is? It's only 4 billion. It's crippling in terms of the actual pressure it puts on young people, and they're planning to buy a home, and they're planning to maybe have a pension one day, or they're planning as to whether they can afford to have children or not. But actually the amount of money raised in terms of actual revenue compared to the debt is tiny. It's only 4 billion. But the psychological impact of that debt is phenomenal. They really need to get rid of it because that student debt is never going to be repaid, but it's crushing a whole generation of young people. I hate it, and it would cost very little to get rid of it. The domicile question. The domicile law says that if you come to the UK and are resident here, i.e. you live here, but you've come to the UK from another country and your natural home is outside the UK, this has nothing to do with nationality or race or ethnicity. It has to do with your place of origin, which is a term defined in the Race Relations Act. Then you do not have to pay tax on your income arising outside the UK if you don't bring it here. Now, this is quite a complicated thing to manage. It's quite a complicated thing to resolve. But the big point about it is, what I've just explained is that wealth can't be here. Because if it was here, it would be taxed here. So every time they say they'll take their wealth away, if only we changed the domicile law, I said, no, you've already taken it away. It never came here because if you brought it here, you'd have paid tax on it anyway. So we know you didn't bring it here because you actually are upset about the fact you might have to pay tax on it. Therefore, it's not here in the first place. So why are you complaining about having to take it away? You're not going to change anything about the UK tax bill you're going to pay by the domicile law changing. And they just don't know how to deal with that. But that's the truth of it. The domicile law actually is on money which is outside the UK now, which we want to tax. I was on Jeremy Vine discussing this, and I was up against a lawyer who was ever so angry about this. And I asked him why he was so angry. I said, the real answer is that you make a fortune out of advising non-domicile people. And what you're really upset about is the fact that you're going to lose your chance to charge them a fortune about how the UK tax system works. You couldn't give a damn about your clients. You're losing your profit opportunity. He didn't like that very much, in fairness. But what they say is that we are going to lose all these talented, amazing people who are going to come to the UK and work here and add value and enhance our society. And then I think about people in boats crossing the English Channel and think, do you know what? An awful lot of them want to come here and add value to our society and be entrepreneurial and create new businesses and create opportunities for their families and everything else. But apparently we don't want them. And I hate the bias and the discrimination and, frankly, the racism in this. The domicile law, I've been arguing against this since 1989. It has to go. It's a horrible law. And for the sake of equality, that we all stand together in the tax system, it has to go. That's also true in the sense of the tax gap. You know, when people think that the tax system is unfair because it favours some at the expense of them, they tend not to comply. And this is one of those reasons why people don't comply. It's just a grossly unfair system.
Okay, I'm going to take, if there's any pressing last couple of questions. I have to take my...
I feel I should say something.
I know, I have to take my old economics
Very
A-level
brief,
teacher.
Don't need, literally, no relation to Rachel. But I noticed there's no mention of confidence in your talks, no mention of the distrust effect, the panic that can set in, and the fact that we can print money or all the debt is owed to people. That applies in Japan very much, but I don't think it applies here. Because once you get close to full capacity and avoiding full employment, then you can get what many economists would argue is that a lax approach to printing money can lead to accelerating inflation. Now, when you used to argue this under Oswald, I fully agreed with you, but not now, because we're close to full capacity. If we're going to spend more money, reveal full capacity in the sense of accelerating pay.
It's hard to talk about full capacity though, isn't it, sir? Because it's like we've still got so much unemployment, so many young people out of work.
Spending needs to be targeted where there is unemployment, where there is, especially in the north, not overall through the country. There's so much I could say. I agree with most of what you're saying, especially in terms of tax, wealth taxes, things like that. All my interest in economics is to do with poverty, basically. And what Rachel Reeves says that she's trying to do is, well, first of all, maintain confidence and avoiding the distrust effect of seeming to be out of control. I don't trust governments, by the way. If she gives that impression she's out of control, you may well get a distrust effect.
Well, that was her argument, wasn't it, for like having to do the winter fuel?
Same as on the left over the years, Labour has got itself into deep trouble with a terrible reputation, particularly amongst older people, for mismanaging the economy before you had independent banking OBR. By the way, I died in a Keynesian. I was in.
But this is why
the other day where he wrote the consequences of the peace.
Yeah.
He's my hero, right? I use his name in many places, including on passwords.
You're meant to tell us
now
that.
we know. J.M. Keynes won.
But we are still suffering from inflation, as you say. Any feeling that we're going to spend more money,
yeah,
I think very much.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point though, because what happened with trust, right? And I think I'm just going to take one more that was at the back.
Anyway, if I say a lot more,
yeah,
thanks. I've got to go because I've got to.
Oh wait.
Oh,
well, you
shame.
can't hear the answer.
Now I escape.
Animal
you can't
spirits.
Hear the answer. Go on right at the back. Sorry.
Anyway, good fun.
Sorry. Thanks. Bye, Mary. Yeah, go on. All right, at the back. Yeah, okay, I'll take that one as well. But yeah, let's go to the back first. Yeah, go on.
It was quite obvious that you don't think GDP is a good measure of success. What would be a good measure of success?
Okay.
Great. And then, yeah, is it a quick one?
Right, well, this chap mentioned politics, this lady mentioned politics and what can be done. I'm old enough to remember the poll tax movement.
Yeah.
And Labour failed us then. They described people like myself, who is not a Marxist, is not an anarchist, works in a bike shop manager, works on the high street, good at his job, trying to get along with life. I remember Kinnock describing us as Toy Town revolutionaries. Labour failed us then, they're clearly failing us again now, so it's time for another can't pay, won't pay campaign, as far as I can see. We've got sewage bills going to go through the roof, we've got electric bills going through the roof, they're talking about maybe getting rid of the single person council tax discount. I can't afford it. So can't pay, won't pay. It's surely got to be time for that, because the neoliberals are just grinding us into the floor. And for a Labour government to be doing it's just beyond belief.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really striking is the point about that Starmer keeps saying about more pain, and I just think, are you totally out of touch? People are already so stressed that you're really at that point where people are gonna kick off in whatever way that looks like.
Can I get excited now?
Do you get excited? Do your last few minutes? I know, Mr. Risa, that was my old economics teacher who taught me to question a lot. If you want to come back to this point, because I do think the Liz Truss point is important. There is a point. There is a point about confidence. Very quickly, then round up, and then we're going to finish off. What time do we need to be out of here? Okay, and then please do feel like you can hang around and have a chat with each other, and I'll talk a bit more about the politics and where we go from here as well. Go on.
Do you know what? Liz Truss didn't crash the economy. I hate to tell you this. I lived in Downham Market for a period of time, and she was my MP. Oh, God.
Oh, gosh.
I promise you I didn't vote for her. Andrew Bailey at the Bank of England crashed the economy because the day before Kwasi Kwarteng stood up and announced his stupid budget, Andrew Bailey announced that there was going to be £80 billion of quantitative tightening. In other words, the loose money policy under quantitative easing, whereby the government kept on injecting new money into the economy by buying government bonds, was going to be reversed, and instead they were going to sell those bonds back into the market, which effectively meant the city was going to have to give money back to the Treasury. It was that which crashed the economy. But Kwasi Kwarteng, stood up the day afterwards and made a pretty stupid speech, and I did listen to it live, as I listened to all these events live, and thought, God, that's rubbish. But it was Andrew Bailey's reckless management of the Bank of England which actually created the crisis, what was called the LDI crisis, that threatened the financial viability of so many pension funds, because none of them are budgeted for this change in the policy of the government from issuing more money into the economy through QE to reversing it and demanding it back through quantitative tightening. So whilst I have just about zero sympathy with Liz Truss on almost anything, I'm afraid to say she didn't crash the economy. However, your teacher's point about confidence is important, and I think it is. And he mentioned Keynes, Lord Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who was the guy who worked out how to pay for the First World War and the Second World War single-handedly by himself. Quite a feat, really. And he wrote some pretty amazing economics along the way, some of which I read, some of which is extremely obscure. I wouldn't recommend his 1921 treatise on the mathematics of economics. It's not easy going. But his point, and he was a great political economist, really was, that what matters most in the economy are the animal spirits of people, by which he meant people's confidence. Are you feeling high? Are you feeling low? And this really matters. I shocked some of my readers on the blog the other day when I admitted that I actually subscribed to Vogue, the online version. Why? Because Vogue is a really good barometer of mood. So are hemlines. They tend to be rather a long way from the ground when confidence is high, and they tend to be very near the ground when confidence is low. And colour palettes tend to be very dull when the world is in bad moods. And I actually put up on my blog the other day a page of an email that had been sent to me by H&M. I actually didn't really want to subscribe to H&M, except one day I went with the boys and bought a whole pile of T-shirts, and I ended up getting their emails. But there you go. And it was all black and brown and grey and sludgy, because this country has low animal spirits right now, where we are lacking in confidence. And we're lacking in confidence most of all at the moment because Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves tell us we should be lacking in confidence. As PR exercises go, it's pretty bloody disastrous. It's foolish, stupid. What else do you want me to call it? They could be talking the economy up. I don't agree that we haven't got the opportunity to do things in this country. There's two ways we have opportunities. One, we still have unemployment, and two, we have vast amounts of underemployment. The number of people who are self-employed in the UK has gone up from around 1 million about a decade, 15 years ago, to over 5 million. Most of those people are disguised unemployed in some way or other. If only they could find a job that suited their needs and paid better and actually kept the benefits office off their back, then they would take it. Lots and lots of people, in fact, sign up for self-employment simply because that's the way to avoid having to apply for 35 jobs a week to actually get their benefit. We are living in an economy where we have a massive underemployment. And unemployment is a much bigger threat to the economy than inflation is. In broad terms, a lot of surveys, they do a lot of work with a man called Danny Blanchflower. Well, he isn't really called Danny Blanchflower, of course, because he didn't play for Tottenham in 1962. He's actually called David Blanchflower, but everybody calls him Danny. And he was on the Monetary Policy Committee at the time of the crash in 2008-9. And together we call ourselves the Mile End Road economists, because we take the view from outside the city wall, which is, of course, where the Mile End Road is. It also happens to be Queen Mary College, where he did his PhD, but that's beside the point. We take the view from elsewhere. And he's done loads of work about confidence and the economy, the precise point here. And the answer is that it isn't things like Liz Truss that shatter economy. It's actually people not believing that the government will support them that shatters the economy. So right now, people are saving for one very big reason. If they think they need a hip replacement operation, they don't think the state's going to provide it, so they're putting their money away, or whatever it might be like that. Or they don't think they're going to get the benefit they need, so they're saving for it. That's what's causing savings. And savings in economic terms take money out of use, they prevent spending, and therefore we get lower growth. So we have to raise the animal spirits, as Keynes would call them, our confidence. We want lots of people in brightly coloured clothes. You're doing better than average tonight. And we want short hemlines, and then we'll know that things are getting better again. So that's really important in that sense. Did I answer you? I can't remember. You were raised that question, was it? No, what was your question?
Oh, what should we have instead of GDP?
What should we have instead? I'd love to have time to read to you Robert Kennedy's speech in 1968 on GDP. It's absolutely brilliant.
Look it up. It comes up really
It's
good.
really easy to look up.
Yeah.
Robert Kennedy, younger brother of JF Kennedy, of course, who made a speech on GDP shortly before he was shot, which is, he was a shame. He was a real intellectual, the brightest of the Kennedys, without a doubt. Shame he was the father of the current Robert Kennedy, who's now supporting Trump, but, you can't have it all. And he just described the terrible things, the nature of GDP. What should we be measuring? The quality of our children's education, that was one on his list. Whether we're preserving our redwoods was another on his list. Let's use that as a proxy for climate change, shall we? Whether we've got peace or not, because he used that as one of his proxies as well. Because GDP massively values war. GDP does not value health. It values illness. Because illness generates work for the NHS and massive profits for drug companies. So what we have to have is a range of measures. There isn't one, but there is well-being. And well-being has to be now and in the long term, and for our children, and for the elderly, and everyone in between. And also, whoever raised the question about the need to support other countries, that was you over there, sir, wasn't it? That's also important, because obviously the tackling of inequality isn't only domestic, it's international as well. And there are massive problems. But I'll tell you one ray of hope I've got. I do actually work at the moment with 3 centres of international socialism. This is not what most of these organisations have been called in the past, but I'm currently doing some work with the IMF, the OECD and the World Bank. They are more in favour of wealth taxation and tackling inequality through wealth than almost any other international organisations that you will come across. And they are telling governments to do it. And isn't that bizarre? That's the last place that I'd have expected this to happen. But they are actually talking about it. Not universally, but parts of those organisations are talking about it in depth and saying, this is what we must do. So there are signs out there that the message is getting through. Don't believe there isn't, because there are signs of change, and change is possible. I genuinely believe that committed people can make change. But we have to keep on talking about it. We have to create new narratives. And that's my last point. It's the stories we tell each other that matter. If we believe we're down, we are down. If we start talking about how we can go up, we can be up. And we on the left have not been very good at telling each other stories about how we can be successful. And if we did, we would begin to be successful, because that's the way it works. Believe in ourselves and the world will believe in us. That's my message.
What an amazing last point. Thank you, Richard. Let's give Richard a It does feel like, of course, you know, Labour keeps talking about it wants economic growth and productivity and all of those things, and it's doing exactly the opposite. So they will flounder, and there will be more people getting upset and more people getting angry, recognizing in their daily life, knowing in their hearts that this is not how we should be doing things, and questioning why it's so much better to live in so many other European countries and people seem to be having, you know, no student loans and all of those things. Why can't we have that here? And so I think that will continue and people will want to join. I do want to say, you know, as someone that's been on a kind of weird journey to still be here, being able to wear colourful clothes, I actually still have faith in something different. And it's because of what happened during the independent campaign and that we kind of inadvertently started something new and how many people joined. And for once, I could see that actually despondency as a good thing. The amount of times I would knock on doors as a Labour candidate and as an independent candidate, where people would just say, why? Why should I vote? This system doesn't work for me. And they're absolutely right. But we can start talking about these things, offering something different. And I think the more the system fails, the more people will ask for something different. And I, you know, was surprised by how well, how much we were able to, just in 4 weeks, get attention, win people over, and really the role of independents and Greens across the country as an alternative. There are more and more people questioning the system. And it just wasn't that way before. And you're absolutely right. I've worked with the World Bank and the IMF over the years, and there's definitely a shift at that level too. And the reason that is because they're failing, right? There's the way in which they approach it, and they're doing the same thing again and again, and it's failing, and more and more people within those institutions are waking up and saying, actually, I mean, there's still a resistance, but there are more people who you wouldn't expect to saying, no, we actually do need a measure of inequality. The World Bank is just adopted a new measure. It wasn't the measure that I was working with Oxfam and were pushing. It wasn't quite as progressive as we want it to be, but they've still adopted something. So that's how they're going to measure success alongside things like GDP now. They're going to look at a measure of inequality. So, you know, things can be shifting. And really, for me, these monthly discussions and coming together, don't forget the power of this. Tell people, bring people, let's grow this. People are scared of this sort of thing. The politicians are scared of this kind of thing, actually. They always used to say to me, Faiza, oh my God, you go on too much about the community. Why are you talking about people? You should just be talking to us in London regional office or whatever. And I was like, no, actually, we need to organise locally. We need to organise at the grassroots. We need to get people every day, in everyday situations, to question things and realise that what is happening is wrong on every level. So this is, as I said, the first of hopefully many discussions. I remembered that I've asked a colleague to come and talk to us about the British class system. I'm sure that's going to be really popular as well. And as we said, inequality, migration, racism, more on the economy. If you've got ideas and thoughts and subjects that you want covered, please email me or mention it to me or mention it to Helen or Alexia or Selassie. And yeah, we'll make that happen. But please also do use these. And let's think about how we can use the space. Like, what are your ideas for what we can do? You know, maybe we should find a way to have drinks afterwards, or, you know, how do we grow this and this connection? And people are welcome from other parts as well, not just Chingford and Woodford Green. So I'm going to leave it there. I don't know if there's anything else that I'm missing that I need to mention. Has everyone signed up? I know there were some new people that came today. If you didn't, please do leave your email addresses or sign up. www.faizashaheen.co.uk. And let's thank Richard once again. It was brilliant. Thank you for joining us.